Hello, and welcome to the Authentication Beyond PIV, Cloud Security and Zero Trust in a Post-COVID Government webinar today. We have with us to open it up, Dean Scontros. He's the head of public sector for Duo, and my name is Ross Nodorf. I should have said that at the beginning. I'm with Venable, but I wanted to kick it over to Dean to start off with. Thank you, Dean, for bringing us together today, and over to you.
Thanks, Ross. First of all, thank you to Venable. We do a lot of these in the post-COVID world, or the COVID world, however you want to look at it. And by far, I think between the speakers and the agenda, this is one of the finer ones. So thank you, Venable, for putting together a fantastic agenda and a fantastic speaker list or presenters. And thank you to all those of you attending as well. I mean, I think we are bombarded every single day with webinars and things to attend. So thank you for choosing to attend. Sincerely appreciate it. Duo, if you don't know us, we're now part of Cisco. Our early tagline when we were still just Duo was democratizing security. I thought it kind of silly at the time. But as I've kind of grown in the position, I've come to love it just because what we're trying to do is make security simple. And usually security has a reputation for being complex and expensive. And Duo does just the opposite. We're a cloud-based FedRAMP solution. When we allow, it's easy to enroll. It's easy to maintain. In fact, we have a federal customer who rolled out over 30,000 users in the course of a couple weeks and had 2 trouble tickets. And that's a perfect example of what I mean by democratizing security. The more people who enroll in it, the better and the more secure the environment is. So right now, if you look at the Duo FedRAMP, look at our status in the marketplace, we are approved at AL1 and AL2. And I think as the title alludes to is that, we're trying to envision a world where maybe we can move beyond PIV. But Duo right now is used for those use cases that PIV and CAC do not support, of which there are a lot, contractors, researchers, use cases, applications, and that's a perfect fit for us today. But the way we like to see it is that we're a cloud-based middleware, and we'll fill those gaps today, but provide you a bridge to the future, no matter where that may be. And hopefully one day that will be a world without PIV, but we understand that that's not gonna happen anytime soon. So in the meantime, we are sort of a gap solution for those gaps. So. Without further ado, I'll hand it back to Ross. Again, thank you very much for attending. We sincerely appreciate it. And give Duo a look if you have any MFA requirements. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dean. All right, so on to the agenda for the day. We're going to start off with hearing from Grant Schneider, who just joined the Venable Cybersecurity Services team from government. He comes to us after over 27 years of government service. He was the CIO for the DIA. He was the federal CISO most recently. He was a senior director on the National Security Council for Cybersecurity. So he's got a pretty good understanding of what is out there right now, what the government is doing as far as cloud security, digital identity, and authentication concerned. Wanted to turn it over for a few minutes to Grant to kind of set the stage. So Grant, over to you.
Thanks, Ross. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Dean, thank you for having us and partnering with Venable on this. And I want to echo Dean's thanks to all of you who are here taking your time today to be a part of the webinar. And I think this is one of the things Dean mentioned and talking about the concept of making cybersecurity simple. I think all things in technology we need to make simple. Because our users don't always want to learn about our technology. They really want to get their mission done, their business done, whatever that is. And we need to find ways that we are meeting them, really meeting them in their space. And so when we talk about security, one of the things that I think about is, we've long held or long realized, I think, that the approach we have taken to cybersecurity, we're securing our data and information around a network or perimeter based, has been outdated. Right? We for years have really focused on, our network, our information is secure because of where we have it stored, and as we've moved forward and moved into leveraging cloud capabilities, mobile environments, the pandemic that we're in now, where we're all working from our homes, we've begun to realize, or we've had a rude awakening that we have far less control over the location of our data than we used to have in the past. And I think as technologists, when we lose that, perceive that we've lost control, we get this feeling, or we lose that feeling of safety as well. And so one of the things we need to do is that while we're always going to lose control of where our data is located, because it might be in a cloud that is hosted by someone else. It might be, right now it's in, our individual employees' homes and basements and wherever they're working from. But while have lost some control over the location of that data, we don't need to lose control over the access to that data. We really need data to be able to essentially protect itself, to be aware of its environment, to be aware of who's trying to access the data, be that a machine or an individual, and know whether or not to grant that access and reveal itself to the individual. In 2017, OMB updated their identity and credential management policy. In that same year, NIST updated their digital identity guidance. And I think those two documents really started to set the stage to have more flexibility around PIV. And Dean talked about PIV. PIV is not just a card. That's what we think of it as a card. But PIV is really about how do I do identity and how am I managing identity? And we should have flexibility, and we have to have flexibility around the various credentials that we use to have that level of assurance of the identity and the authentication of a person or a machine that's trying to access our data and information. This has been absolutely paramount as the government and the rest of the world shifted to a telework environment literally overnight. I think some groundwork had been laid, allowed us to make those shifts relatively seamlessly. However, I think there's been a lot of concern among federal CISOs on are there security, is there added vulnerability, are we added risk to the environment by some of those shifts that we've made in the telework world, and how do we need to be thinking about our systems going forward, and how do we need to be protecting them, what do we need to do and continue to grow and learn more around identity management, which I think is a key part of the thing we typically now call a zero trust environment, right? And that I'm not going to trust, again, the location of my data, but I want to be able to control the access to the data, and that identity management piece is absolutely critical to that. So I think we've made a lot of headway in this area. There is a lot of work to do. I'm looking forward to the rest of the conversation this afternoon to hear what the Army is doing and to really see where folks are trying to take this in the future. So I want to, again, thanks Duo. Thank you, Ross, for having me here today. I look forward to the conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Grant. We appreciate you jumping in to speak with us. So now we're going to move over to our keynote address today. I'd like to thank Mr. Paul Puckett for joining us today. He's the director of the Army's Enterprise Cloud Management Office, the ECMO. So, Paul, we wanted to give you an opportunity just to talk about the ECMO, a little bit of your background, what you want to tell us to begin with, and then we'll dive into some Q&A. And then for those of us who are watching, if you are interested in submitting some questions, please feel free to do so into the Q&A. And if we have time, we're going to get to a couple of those at the end. So, Paul, if you could unmute your camera, your mic.
Absolutely. Hey, Ross, can you hear me all right?
Hear you great.
Beautiful. Ross, thanks for having me. Thanks for Duo for putting this on. Love every single opportunity I can when it comes to talking about what the Army is doing and leveraging the cloud to operationalize our data and to drive better IT efficiency and kind of the way that we do business. I mean, if we want to kind of keep the thread, the whole entire point of my office and why the Army leaned into creating the Enterprise Cloud Management Office is because we need to make leveraging cloud computing simple for the Army. It's really that simple. Really, it's just the barrier to entry when it comes to all the different governance requirements, the technological skill sets, the expertise, understanding the opportunity to the commercial cloud, as well as a hybrid, private-public cloud architecture offers us for our mission. We have to understand that opportunity, but we also have to understand kind of where we are, kind of where our technical debt lies, how we perhaps have been doing things poorly that doesn't leverage cloud computing in a thoughtful way. And it's too challenging. There's too many barriers to entry when it comes to adopting cloud to try and deliver an effective and efficient outcome for the Army mission. And so that's why the Army leaned in and said, we've been learning on this cloud journey for a while now. I think everyone knows the Army put out a cloud strategy back in 2015. And we've been learning on this cloud journey for a while. What are we doing that's working, and what are we doing that's not working? And one of the things that was not working is there was really no driver for the community around how we are smart and how we adopt cloud. There was no driver when it came to some of those enterprise contracts that need to be in place to lower the barrier to entry for perhaps duplicative work that we're doing across the programs or the commands, and even just acquiring cloud services or expertise really to even just help us on that journey. And so what the Army did is they carved just nearly $1 billion, about $750 million over the course of a couple of years. And they said, we're going to treat this as seed money for modernization for the United States Army. We're going to stand up an office that's responsible for updating the strategy, codifying the strategy, and then now driving the execution of this strategy for how we need to show our outcomes leveraging cloud computing in a thoughtful way. Let's move from this cloud first, just kind of all-in cloud lift and shift model to let's be smart about how we're adopting cloud. Let's invest in our people. Let's invest in the way that we are procuring cloud, and let's invest in kind of how we are moving in this new security model for how we need to adopt cloud thoughtfully. So, there's a lot of details when it comes to the ECMO, and I've talked about them in a number of different forums, but really we're structured around a few key kind of like elements and things that we're driving towards. First, there's some commonality when it comes to the services that we need to provide a secure cloud ecosystem to build mission capabilities with it. And so typically this takes the form of some of the components of the SCCA from DISA, but really there needs to be someone responsible for just delivering the basic services of the Army enterprise in the cloud. And so we've delivered Army enterprise cloud services. We call them C-Army. You can think of this as kind of that secure foundation, soon to be a hybrid cloud ecosystem. And then we're expanding obviously in classification to capture the entire Title 10 needs of the Army. One of the second pieces that we're leaning into is our actual software and how we build and field software. And so a lot of movement across the DoD, which is outstanding in this world of collapsing our time from a good idea to functional operational capabilities in the hands of our warfighters. And the teams from development through security through operations that all now need to come together to accelerate these timelines. And so the notion of DevSecOps. And so my team's responsible for delivering an Army enterprise environment for enabling these worlds of DevSecOps, leveraging a continuous integration and delivery pipeline, cloud native platform. And there's a partnership there I think many are now aware of between our office and the AFC software factory that's standing up. And so it's awesome to see the Army leaning in hard and our soldiers and civilians to become software developers and engineers and data scientists to truly own their future. And then the third piece here is the data side of the house. So back in April, the Secretary signed a memo for data services requirements for the Army for all new acquisitions. And this is a number of different things, but kind of foundational to this is the way that we now exchange data. And so moving from this world of your typical point-to-point architectures, we're trying to move to a more open architecture in how we expose data and services as an open service that any capability can now call on in a secure manner. And so leveraging the power of APIs, application programming interfaces, and other ways for how we exchange data in an open way, we see as just absolutely foundational to the way that we do business in the future. So that kind of these pieces of common services and then common data services, common software services, we see as a foundational element to how we train and enable, upskill and rescale our soldiers and civilians to fight and win in this digital age. And so complementing the technology and the people is now finding where in our processes that we can change. And so part of the Army CIO, we've got a great opportunity for my peers in the CIO and really the rest of HQDA for where in our business processes can we see optimization and change for the way that we're doing business. We should no longer see these lead times of acquiring infrastructure that takes months, if not years. We should no longer see this kind of notion where I have to validate requirements in a massive process that takes years to finally get a program stood up, when if I've got the ability to experiment in real time and put a capability in the hands of a warfighter and get immediate validation for whether I've actually made their life better, I've actually added value to their mission, we should see these timelines from ID production absolutely chunk down into days, if not hours and minutes. And so really driving that change. And I'm fortunate enough to be part of the ECMO and the first director of the ECMO driving that change. But the beautiful thing is this has senior leader buy-in in the Army, unlike I've ever seen before in a service. And the same can be said for the DoD CIO for the journey that we're on right now. And it's not to say that it's easy by any means. It's definitely going to be a challenge. But I'm seeing leadership for creating irreversible momentum when it comes to modernizing the Army. And I'm just super thankful to be a part of the journey. So would love to dive into whatever questions you have about the Army, how we're thinking about security, obviously the relevance of identity, especially in this post-COVID world, what this means for a transition to zero trust architecture, how we see that journey going, some of the challenges and opportunities along the way. We'd love to dive into anything that helps you understand kind of the way that we're thinking of the mission that we have. And then I'd love to ensure that to follow up and complement the Army Cloud Plan for 2020 that my team built for the Army earlier this year is now out and it's public and consumable. So I want to make sure that there's an opportunity for everyone to read that and follow up if there's any kind of edges that I haven't talked about or that we get to engage about. Just want to make sure that we're sharing everything about our journey and how we're moving on that journey, and would love feedback in ways that we can improve upon that.
That's great. That's super helpful. I've started, I think, in probably an area that is for me at least, what I've heard is one of the most important areas as that's foundational to any of the development that you're talking about, right? You mentioned just now there are several barriers to entry that the Army had identified before, as it was thinking about standing up the ECMO. And I'm sure there's technology barriers, policy barriers, acquisition barriers, but the one barrier specifically that you alluded to, and I think that they had tapped you for because they identified your prior experience doing this is the cultural barrier, right? Traditional Army is not known as the most bleeding edge technology producer, consumer. How do you come in as the director of the ECMO and really drive the cultural change necessary to have the rest of it fall into place?
Ross, it's I like the way that you phrased the question. I want to make something really explicit. I was thinking about this over the weekend. Maybe I'll hit it this way. When I first came on board, was talking to a number of different people, was making a number of office calls, and I chatted about this in a recent podcast. People were like, hey, we're really excited for you to come on board and the culture change that you're going to enable. And I'd made a comment about this, about the last job I was at, is people would engage the company because they're like, hey, we hear you deal in culture change. But there's one thing I want to be really explicit about. There is something beautiful about the culture of the Army when it comes to 1.4 million people who have dedicated their lives to go into harm's way to protect us and our values. But when we think about that culture, we should do everything we possibly can to preserve that culture, to encourage that culture. And so whenever I talk about culture change, I really want to be really pointed in that thing that we think that we want to change. And it gets down to what I would say is we've kind of calcified ourselves around leaning into process. And a lot of kind of the the flow, if you will, for how we take requirements and deliver capabilities, especially when you're dealing with an organization with 1.4 million people, a global organization with a mission that is nearly unparalleled. There's a certain amount of structure and policy and governance and oversight that makes sense, especially when we talk about the limitations of the PC era, especially when we talk about the fact that there's only so much money, only so much people. I need to ensure that I am being thoughtful about what requirements I'm meeting and which ones I'm not. If I'm going to meet my mission, if I'm going to invest, if I'm going to ask for money, I want to make sure that I get it right. It's driven this PPPE process that everyone's really familiar with. And so when we talk about changing the culture and kind of leaning into IT and understanding technology, it's changing a culture where information technology is the critical asset to the way that we need to fight and win the war that we are in today, which is an information and cyber war. And we have to know, it can no longer be this thing that we acquire as just a contract. It can no longer be this thing that, like, the nerds are dealing with. This has to be something that is innate to how we fight and win wars, and we need to see software and data as a strategic asset, no differently than we do tanks and bullets, right? And so how we make that shift, that's the cultural shift that I've absolutely dedicated my life to, I'm passionate about. That's the thing that we need to see change in. And seeing change in that opportunity is to enlighten people's eyes just to how many pains that they've had in trying to execute their mission today that has been dependent upon a lagging process for how we acquire, build, and field IT solutions. A lot of that culture change is kind of peeling back the layers and understanding, oh, good Lord, like, are you telling me that the reason why I'm fielding a capability that kind of looks like I've stepped back 10 years is because I had to lock down 10 years ago the requirements that I needed to meet? And if I were to change that, the cost of change is too high, so I can't make those changes. If I were to test that, it's too late in the process for me to actually make those changes because the test came back. And so I have to accept all of this risk and this old legacy capability that may not even be relevant to how I fight today. Peeling back those layers and helping people understand, I've got the ability to provision infrastructure at the push of a button, which means I've got the ability to experiment with ideas that are relevant today and get them fielded today and see if they actually work, if my hypothesis is actually correct. That shift and that change is the cultural change that we're talking about. And it's that there's process changes that happen there. It's a skill set change that happens there. It's also a leadership and organizational change that needs to happen there. So when I talk about culture change, I want to be pointed. That's the thing that we're trying to change. We don't want to change the hearts and the minds and the souls of the people that fight and win wars for our nation. That has to be preserved at all counts. What we need them is to see software and data as a strategic asset in that fight. And we codify this in the sense that we need to have digital overmatch. We need to be better skilled, more armed, more proficient, absolute experts in the way that we yield information technology and data as an asset to fight and win wars. And so the vision of the ECMO is deliver digital overmatch with data-driven outcomes at the speed of operational relevance. And we think that codifies, it really captures the point and the existence of the ECMO and what it is that we're trying to do. So I hope that answered your question. You can sense the passion in me, but I want to be pointed about what culture we're changing and why.
No, that's helpful and clarifying. I do have one addendum to that, or one follow-on question is, you said at the beginning you're seeing it at the leadership level, right? And they wouldn't have invested the money, the resources to have the ECMO even exist. Are you starting to see it down at the level, the combatant level? Are you starting to see it down at the service member level, at the civilian level?
We are. So it's people that understand the operational imperative, right? Like, in order to be relevant in today's world, you need to yield data and software as a strategic asset. And so senior leadership sees it, thankfully, and it's awesome to see the push. Even just the other day, the comment that was made is the caliber of the conversations that we're having is exponential compared to where we were a year ago. Just kind of the technical nuance and the detail and the implications to our people and processes has fundamentally changed at the senior level. And we're starting to see the aha moments for the people that keep the lights on today, that keep fighting wars today, is creating just enough time in the learning and understanding of the imperative, right? Some of the pains and the challenges that they have and that they're seeing is the opportunity that lies at the other end of leveraging cloud computing in a thoughtful way. And that's being seen by, engaging and conversating with people, trying things with people, getting hands-on with people. And so the more that we build this community that understands the imperative, the narrative is starting to seep in all of the nooks and crannies across the Army and the DoD for just precisely kind of what this imperative is. But where we see the challenge then, and also the opportunity, is, okay, so what do I do about it? A lot of people struggle with kind of what that first step looks like, and a lot of it is learning. It's just upskilling, it's just understanding the domain a little bit better. And so thankfully, we've got senior leadership leaning in there as well. But we are seeing this permeate across other layers and organizations, through the 06 and the colonels and the GS-15s into the 14-13s and the rest of the workforce.
That's helpful. So it's great news. And one of the things, the other things that you mentioned in your opening was some of the partnerships that you're having, right? As you talk into the Army, you're also talking out to the DoD, right? And you guys just released the Army Cloud Plan, which we'd love to hear a little bit more about. But I think one of the questions that's on people's mind is that, and it's in the papers too, right? I mean, people are seeing different movements, whether it's at DoD writ large towards more cloud consumption, or the Air Force is moving forward with the software factory, and it's great that you guys have that partnership now. So there are things that people are reading about outside, and they want to understand, okay, so how does the ECMO, how does the cloud strategy that the Army have meld with, flow into, operate in conjunction with the broader DoD cloud strategy, to include, but not limited to, the contract vehicles that are out there like JEDI and some of the other movements that they have across the service branches. So you can help us understand that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So, I mean, if we look at the DoD cloud strategy, it is a multi-hybrid cloud strategy that's putting the power of cloud computing into the hands of the DoD to execute its mission. If we look at the Defense Industrial Base software study that they did, one of the first of the 10 commandments is just, hey, make access to cloud computing ubiquitous. Like make that like no longer a conversation that we have to have challenges with. Like, it's just a given. It's just simply the way that we fight. But then there's now, with those resources, how do we actually integrate them in the way that all the various services have worked through the planning, the budgeting process? How do we change the business processes themselves, the security accreditation processes? How do we get the various communities across all the various services understanding the now imperative for what this means for the way that they're doing business? What needs to change? What relatively stays the same? What is entirely something brand new that we've got to learn a whole bunch about? And how are we driving that execution within the various services that's leaning on the lessons learned of others, but to a degree, there's a certain amount of hands-on and doing that people need to actually see the change. They got to be a part of the change to see the change, to become an advocate of what needs to change, so that can continue to permeate. And if that's just kind of something like, hey, they're all doing it right, so we can't outsource everything and all of that change. We need to bring this community along with us. And so the DoD cloud strategy is multi-hybrid cloud strategy, driving better oversight and governance so we can be better, assets of the resources that we've been given. Like we need better accountability here for how we're actually seeing the way that we're consuming cloud services. Are we being efficient in the way that we're buying and consuming and leveraging cloud services? I mean, there's this massive shift from what is typically a sunk cost in a data center for a fixed architecture. Now is this utility that we can use or not use? Are we designing our systems in a way that complements that? And are we driving the digital talent that we need? And so the Army, you can think of the ECMO as kind of the asset within the Army that's ensuring that the DoD cloud strategy is being integrated into the way that we do business of the Army. And that's being done essentially as a community. So as we tease out the edges of what a secure cloud ecosystem looks like, how do we need to orchestrate the infrastructure, what changes perhaps in policy or the greater architecture need to be had, is there's a feedback loop. DoD CIO and the things that they hear and learn from the services becoming clarity that's now shared across the community that permeates in governance and policy and direction, or even tweaks and change in existing policy. There's this community that has to exist there. Just the other week, I did a chat with Mr. Pete Ranks and Mr. Nicholas Shylon from the Air Force, is there are teams that meet weekly, if not daily, and scrubbing these challenges that we're seeing, providing feedback to each other, and then executing. And so there's this kind of organizational construct where we're, self-organizing teams trying to dive into the details to execute the DoD cloud strategy, where we need to create this ecosystem that's able to create and share data in real time, because at the end of the day, our mission is a joint mission. No service fights alone. And so how we provide our data and our services that may actually be better used, not just by the Army, but by the entire DoD, we probably need to redesign those services in a way to accommodate that scale. And so how we make those shifts and those changes, and we make it simply just the way that we do business to fight and win wars together, creating a globally dominant cloud ecosystem. And so if we dive into the mission of the ECMO, it's continuously enhancing our digital literacy. So how do we drive the knowledge and the skill sets and the way that we just understand and talk about the opportunity, driving that as a key change within the Army? How do we deliver data, software, and business transformation in order to complement this joint way that we need to fight and win wars? And how do we ensure that we're delivering capabilities on a globally dominant cloud platform? Those are the three essentially points, if you will, of the ECMO mission and why we exist. And so I simply see myself and my team and the community that we're creating within the Army as executors of the shared DoD cloud strategy, and just how we see this as an asset for the way that we need to fight and win wars together.
So I'm cognizant of time, so I want to move on to you talked about the use of data. You talked about leveraging open formats through APIs to do so. I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about the work you've done to date on that, and then the role that identity and access management also play as you look to secure that data. I think one of the questions that you and I had talked about a little bit was look, we have all this. If we undo all these silos, then all of a sudden we have all this data and we're pulling it together. Is there some type of a mosaic effect that happens, and all of a sudden we have a different classification than we did before? So what's the role of identity and access management? How does that meld with the current way that you're looking to secure your data?
Yeah, there's a number of pieces. So the ECMO stood up on November 25th. Essentially, that was my first day. So kind of like a CAC. It was the stand-up of the ECMO. 6 days prior, on November 19th, the Army released a data execution order. And since then, we've issued 2 more fragos. And essentially, it's all about the Army starting to see itself. And it was an execution order that said, hey, we want to understand the named applications and systems in your portfolio for your given mission engineering threads that you have, right? Kind of the major initiatives and why those systems exist. We also need to understand the data. What data are you creating? What data are you consuming? How are you storing it? How are you sharing it? And starting to understand what data and services we really have. And this dives into, and I'll kind of jump to the aggregation side of the house, is some of the challenges with the network perimeter security model that we have today. If someone gets into our environment, there's lateral movement. And one of the challenges, we don't know what that actual now aggregated and joined data is. Like, if I know this and this and this and this and this, what information would near peer adversary have that actually isn't unclassified in nature? Now that kind of joint picture that they can see, that mosaic that you're saying, what other information might that be able to allow them to derive? And so we need to get to a place where we need to understand what data we have, where and how it's being stored, in order for us to have any hope, dream, and desire of transitioning to a zero trust model. Because in a zero trust model, most people kind of pick and choose kind of which variable in that ecosystem equation that makes up zero trust in their mind. But I'll typically dive into how are we creating an identity for every single device, every single host, every single application, every single service, every single data set. There's metadata, there's something I know about that thing, right? And so how I understand all of those components, all of those attributes in a way that allows me to say, okay, I know you in this way, and I'm going to identify you in this way. And if you need to be shared and talk to this other thing, how am I, authenticating and authorizing that relationship to happen at a given moment in time? There's this really fine-grained control that we have tying these attributes, tying the credentials that they share and pass with one another, essentially in a shared ecosystem, ensuring that that transaction is secured in a way that no one else can get into the knickers of what's happening. To move from the world that we have today to that world, we have to understand what data we're protecting. This is going to be a journey. This is not something that you just buy and turn the lights on for zero trust. This is going to be something that we have to eat this elephant, right? So which data sets do we need to start and understand that are most relevant to our mission today? And how do we start to redesign those systems now, the applications and the data in a way that complements the zero trust architecture and starts to tease out these principles? You have to start somewhere. And so the Army put out the data execution order to start somewhere, to see ourselves so that we can drive modernization, investment, and resources in the most valuable place for our mission and start to create this future state architecture of a zero trust architecture implementing these principles. So I mean, to your point, identity is critical, but understanding the attributes of the data and the service and the software and the system, and now designing those systems, redesigning those systems in a way where they can still accomplish their mission in a timely manner in order to accommodate kind of those controls, if you will, that we put on that. We've got to tap into on-demand cloud computing. There's a certain amount of unknown there that we buy down that risk when it comes to on-demand infrastructure. Whereas if we tried to design that within a fixed architecture, we would surely design the infrastructure incorrectly. And we would find that we'd probably hit a limitation for what we really need. So as we learn on this journey, cloud is critical to that. And the Secretary recognizes that, and cloud being foundational to the Army modernization strategy. And so now that on-demand computing resource is what enables us to truly unlock the value of our data, but to do so securely, especially in the world as contested as we are today in digital warfare.
And one more, just follow on there, and then we have one more question. This one's actually from the audience, but it melds kind of with what you were referencing earlier. So the follow-on question is, knowing that there is a DoD identity and access management policy and strategy that's evolving out there, are you guys leveraging and working with the folks that are driving that type of policy forward as you're developing the cloud security parameters that you guys are putting in place for the ECMO?
Yeah, absolutely. So, diving into a little bit of the details, as COVID hit and as we leaned into CVR, and we get this environment where literally at the push of a button, I can tap into any person that works in the DoD, bring a couple other people into the conversation, start having a chat, is just this power that exists at our fingertips to be able to share information and talk in real time, and just kind of this beautiful way that we need to just talk. It's been a huge asset. And so with the shift to an impact level 5 DoD cloud environment for Office 365, one of the aha moments is as we move into kind of a multi-tenant ecosystem again, rather than the single tenant we find today, as we move to a multi-tenant ecosystem, we've got to have shared understanding and identity across these tenants. And so I was fortunate to be part of the early conversations with Cloud Computing Program Office, and some of these aha moments of like, friends, we need to lean in heavily when it comes to a DoD global directory. And so I've got a small team of people that we were able to kind of be at the early stages of that coordination. And as we move towards the Army's adoption of Office 365, currently being an earlier adopter of that global identity, and then also in part of the Army's pilot that I think many are aware of for the zero trust pilots that are going on for how we enable access to that Office 365 environment from unmanaged non-GFE devices outside of the footprint of the DoDIN. So yeah, we're early adopters of that global identity. I think it's absolutely a step in the right direction. Where I see us learning and growing is now in all the various ways that we start to leverage that global identity and for how we manage users and attributes, who's a privileged user, how we start to tie in the various systems and services that we're bringing to bear, where we can have this kind of like unified, truly global directory and capability, but also our ability to now manage authentication and authorization in a globally scalable manner. Is for the Army, so much of what we do is in a tactical, disconnected environment where comms are limited. How we ensure that the value of that global identity is extended to the far edges of the way that we fight and win wars is absolutely critical. So we're part of that from the kind of the ground floor moving up, and so I'm absolutely certain that we're going to figure that out together, because it's something that not just the Army needs, but the entire DoD as well. And I'm really excited for where that team and kind of the community is going on that that whole narrative.
That's great. Thank you. And then look, we've got 2 minutes before we got to kick it over to the panel, but I do want to ask one more question. And this was from the audience, and it ties in exactly what you're talking about. What is the role of a partner versus a solution provider, and what can industry do, and what can your internal stakeholders do to really help get at the broader problem sets that you're facing as you try and stand up these solutions?
Yeah, so I made a comment before. We need partners and not products, and I think the thing that I'm really trying to poke at is this is a journey. If we come to the table and we're like, hey, this is precisely the problem that we have, we can't be convinced otherwise. We want people to collaborate with us and kind of like chew on those rough edges. Like, is that really true? We want people that are helping us in, we're instilling a culture of continuous learning. We've got to dive into this whole realm of technology in a way that we never have before. Help us learn, help us understand, dive into us and start to visualize where we have debt, where we have, we're spending people's time where we shouldn't be. We're spending money where we shouldn't be. We're not even using, or perhaps, misusing licenses in a way that, like, there's greater efficiencies that we had here. Or even the design of our IT systems is that in the community that exists in private industry is you've built a product that solves a problem that enhances the value of your customers. Is that aha moment to understand truly the problem that we have, and just the way that your product can help, but then also understand that there's now a journey to like integrate that product into our ecosystem. There's a legacy world that's keeping the lights on today that has to function within. There's now work that needs to be done where we've seen challenges. I've seen this over in the private sector, and I've seen it in the Army, and even my previous life in the civilian side is there's almost sometimes too much of a like, oh, everything's solved with this product. And then the journey to actually get it leveraged and understood and used and integrated is super challenging. And it's almost this dynamic where we didn't set the expectation, from the partner side or even the government side of just the journey that we need to go on, because at the end of the day, the government and private industry are better served with reaching an outcome. You're not done at the point of sale. You're done at the point of an outcome delivered. And back to your comment about culture is, I worked for a company that sold a product as well, but we weren't done at the point of sale. We had to get to an outcome that made people's lives better in this mission. So as long as you understand that's the place where we all succeed, that's the kind of partners that I want. So that's what I would kind of describe. Help us truly understand our problems, help us learn, help us get smarter, help us leverage your product more effectively, but set the expectation that we're on a journey and ensure that, we're in that fight with you to get to that operational outcome with you. And so that's where I'd love for people to engage. And that's where I'd love even my office to come and be an asset for that learning in that moment is just growing our technical skill sets and knowledge of our people, of our soldiers and civilians is absolutely critical. That's the sustainability here. If there's something to sustain, it's our people and our knowledge and our continuous learning mindset. That's where I think is the greatest investment, is people on a journey together delivering outcomes.
Well, thank you very much. That was fantastic. We appreciate all your time talking with us today. And if we have any other questions from the audience, what we'll do is I'll follow up with you guys on the back end and make sure you have them and the folks that are asking them. So thank you very much for spending the time with us today. And now what I'm going to do is quickly kick it over to Jeremy Grant, who can introduce and kick off the panel for us. Thanks again, Paul.
Hey, thanks, Ross. Thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks, Ross, and thanks, Paul. That was a great discussion. So I'm Jeremy Grant. I'll be your moderator for the next portion of this panel. As background, I'm yet another member of the cybersecurity team at Venable. My focus in most of my career has been the intersection of identity and cybersecurity, both in industry as well as some time on the Hill and some time up at NIST. On my side, I also coordinate an organization, the Better Identity Coalition, which has been focused a lot on the consumer identity side. I don't know if we're going to focus quite as much there today as we will on the enterprise world, talking about some of the themes that we've hit in Grant's opening statement and then the discussion we just had with Paul. I'm going to ask all of my panelists if they can now please go ahead and basically push their buttons to activate their microphones and their video, and we'll start with this discussion.
Hi, Jeremy.
All right, so I'm seeing Wendy pop in, and Ross, and Rick, and do we have Sean?
Yeah, I'm right here. Hey, Grant.
Excellent. All right, we can hear Sean if not see him. Well, let me start right off the bat with asking everybody to just give an introduction to themselves. Well, introduce themselves, I should say, to everybody else who's watching. Wendy, let me start with you, and then I'll ask Ross to go, and then Rick and Sean. Thank you.
Sure. Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us. I'm Wendy Nather. I used to be a Chief Information Security Officer in the public and private sectors, as well as an industry analyst and research director. At Duo, which is now part of Cisco, I lead the advisory CISO team.
Great, thanks. Ross?
Great. Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Ross Ford. I work at CISO, and I'm on the CDM program, and I'm the ICAM SME there.
Great, thanks. And I'm not seeing everybody on my screen the way we're set up, but I think up next would be Rick Pina from WWT.
Hey, thanks, Jeremy. I appreciate it. My name is Rick Pina. I'm the Chief Technology Advisor for Public Sector at Worldwide. I served in the Army for 25 years, so I really enjoyed Paul Puckett's discussion. And primarily at Worldwide, we focus on doing exactly what Paul talked about, which is not just focusing on products, but actually focusing on being a partner with our customers and providing integrated solutions. So I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Great. And finally, Sean.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. My name is Sean Connolly. I lead the TIC program, Trusted Internet Connections program at CISA. And just a little side note, when Venable reached out and asked if I'd be on the panel, of course I said sure. And then they said, oh, by the way, Wendy Nather's going to be on the panel. And that was an immediate hook for me. So it's a professional and personal honor for me to be on the panel with Wendy. So thank you.
Wow, that's so nice. Thank you.
It is now, but for a moment I thought you were going to say you had to think twice about whether you wanted to participate in this. So I didn't know where that was going. I'm glad we've ended up in a happy place. So let's jump into the panel. We've got about 40 minutes to talk. So we've obviously heard a lot about the cloud and how it's kind of an important thing. Army and DoD are rapidly moving toward cloud deployments, some of which have been long planned, and some of which have been hastened by the fact that we were suddenly 4 or 6 months ago to really change the way we're doing business because of the global pandemic hitting. So I wanted to ask each of you to just touch, whether you're in government or in the private sector, are you seeing other federal departments and agencies outside the Defense Department, outside the Army, I should say, some other parts of DoD, as well as in the civilian agencies making similar moves? So who wants to start with that?
Yeah, so Jeremy, this is Ross, I'll start. So on CDM program, we've actually helped support some of the agencies, accelerate their movement to the cloud. The CDM program has a pretty large base of agencies that we support in the federal civilian government. And one of the agencies, SBA, when they were engaging CDM, they said, that's good, but we really need you to help us get to the cloud because that's the dynamic they want to do. So we worked with them, we helped them pilot how they would move to the cloud and do it in the way that CDM can help measure. And I'm sure Sean can talk about that too, because it wasn't just the CDM program that helped with that. It was Sean and the team that helped to modernize the Trusted Internet Connection program as well.
Yeah, and Sean, can I ask you to pick up where Ross left off with some of the things with TIC and what have you been helping drive?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So it's a collective effort across .gov. I mean, you just look at the timing in terms of what happened with the telework surge and just some of the activity across .gov. Of course, OMB last year released their updated Trusted Internet Connection Initiative in September. At the same time, NIST released their first draft of the Zero Trust architecture. And full disclosure, I always try to make sure everyone understands, while I'm listed as one of the 4 authors on the special pub, the other 3 authors are the rock stars. I'm more the Ringo Starr of the group. But so you have the NIST special pub, you have OMB, GSA, of course, with Enterprise Infrastructure Solutions and what they're doing. There's all this other activities. Of course, what CISA is doing in the background what Ross talked about with CDM, the NCPS, the Einstein team. So a lot of these activities just happen to be coming to fruition right when the pandemic hit. And then you start to hear about the agencies and just this massive shift to telework. The one agency we work regularly with, they had a 900% increase in the collaboration platform, over a 250% increase in their desktop solutions, a 500% increase in their VPN use. And you hear this across the board. Most agencies are now 90+% in terms of telework. And it's, again, across government effort, and it's encouraging to see how this is all coming together to support the agencies moving forward.
Yeah, Jeremy, I would add that, you know, most agencies, especially in the government, have been talking about cloud for years. And we had finally got around to moving out, and then COVID happened. So obviously with COVID, there was an immediate shift of the attention to enabling a remote workforce. And then now we're seeing agencies kind of realize that, hey, cloud could actually help with the remote worker. So as an example, DHS recently issued a revised TIC guidance to move some patching libraries into the cloud, right? So that would alleviate some of the burden on-prem, where remote users were coming on-prem to be patched. And so now they can do that remotely. So those type of things, as far as enabling the remote worker, these organizations were already moving to the cloud. At least, you know, the rhetoric said that they were moving to the cloud. But now the remote worker being the driving force, I would think that now you're going to see more and more agencies leverage the cloud. I just hope that they do it in a smart way, that they're not just putting a Band-Aid on a solution for the remote worker, that they're doing it in such a way that they're planning towards the future so that they could see a true return on investment.
Yeah. And Wendy, you're obviously seeing a lot of this, you know, both with government clients that you're working with, but also in the private sector. Are you seeing any sorts of different trends in the private sector, or is this a time when government and industry are actually starting to look a little bit the same?
They're looking pretty much the same in terms of panicked rush to the cloud. And it's not just the remote access that we think about when we think of remote workers. It's business processes like onboarding and offboarding securely. It's supply chains that collapsed or got terribly strained at a time when workers suddenly didn't have anything they could take home and work with, so they had to use whatever they happened to have at home. And it's collaboration on a broader scale. It's working together on documents live, not just safely sending files back and forth. And of course, it's video. Within broader Cisco, there was one day in May where we hosted 5 million minutes of meetings on a single day. 5 million meeting minutes. If that's not a tragedy, I don't know what is.
Thanks. Oh, I wanted to ask next, you know, so obviously the way we're doing everything has shifted a lot the last 6 months. Lots of remote work, a lot more happening in the cloud. Obviously with this, the attack surface changes, the threats are changing. And I wanted to, you know, ask each of you to talk a little bit about how, you know, this shift is changing the attack surface and what that might mean for the types of controls that enterprises need to be thinking about in order to, you know, what do you got to prioritize to address these new types of threats?
Well, I'll go ahead and start with that. We definitely see the security models changing, as well as the authentication factors that are being used now that people are working remotely. And the assumptions behind those, of course, have been thrown out. We learned, for example, that Face ID doesn't work very well when you're wearing a mask. Or in healthcare, sharing a fingerprint reader for biometrics is not sanitary anymore. These are the sorts of things that people are having to adapt to at the last minute. And in the gaps here between what people were using, the security controls that they were used to, and the ones that they're having to adopt in a hurry, that's where the adversary is jumping in, particularly when there is a gap that can be arbitraged between the authentication flows that we used before and what we're having to use now with what's available.
Thanks.
Yeah, Wendy, if I could just piggyback off of what Wendy said, if you think about it in a macro sense, it makes sense, right? That organizations had probably invested decades into where they were pre-COVID. And so now they have this environment that's somewhat static. It's on-prem, it's focused. Some of it is moving towards the cloud. And then all of a sudden, COVID happened. Many organizations had to shift so fast that they probably didn't think through the second and third order impacts. And then all of a sudden, their network topology has changed. The attack surface has changed. And so recently, the Center for Internet Security said that successful attacks were up by 46%. The FBI Cyber Crime Center said that cyber crime has tripled since the beginning of COVID. And I think it's what Wendy said is the speed and like the shock of COVID really kind of left an opportunity for the enemy to get in many cases. And now they're going to have to go back and clean that up.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I was talking the other day to one of the groups that compiles the annual, reports on all the bad things that happen in cyberspace each year, and trying to get a preview of what they're going to release in a couple months, and their take was, yeah, it's a doozy. You're not going to like what you see. This is going to really expose the soft underbelly of everything, and I think the cost of what we've had to endure dealing with this shift in order to try and keep good parts of the economy running. But I think we've also seen the attacks have shifted a lot. In fact, I talked to a bank on a webinar a couple months ago who said they're actually seeing some types of fraud are down less, they think, because the fraudsters are going to chase unemployment checks in the state unemployment systems that have a lot less security and anti-fraud than the banks do. So I wanted to ask each of you just to talk, both in government and the commercial world, what have been some of the most pervasive or successful attack vectors that you've been seeing these last 6 months? What has changed?
Yeah, this is Sean. I could start off. So when we started looking back at the TIC2 architecture, which is that traditional castle and moat, and the attack surface back then was more, you'd see adversaries trying to look for buffer overflows and bind DNS or send mail, or maybe looking for users to browse to a website. But you look at how, like you're saying, Jeremy, how the attacks are shifting. So now adversaries are trying to get users to click on something, maybe in some social messaging app, right? And how do you put security controls around the social messaging app? Or maybe the adversaries spun up a fake social networking profile and trying to gain trust to an employee through that fake network profile. Or even the adversary could just be simply scanning internet systems, looking for something that's misconfigured. And so those attacks are shifting to everywhere those traditional network security controls are not located. And then another example, FBI and CISA in August, right, released that one advisory that cyber criminals take advantage of increased telework through phishing. That's V for phishing campaign. And you saw where the adversaries were starting off this attack by they're creating fake login pages. Many attackers are actually calling the employees and encouraging them to log on to those fake pages and then grabbing the credentials from those pages. It's just a totally new attack vector altogether than where we were before. And so, and that question, that natural evolution question for you, what does zero trust? How can that be that solution to support those new type of architectures?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? And you're right that in our Talos intelligence group, we've seen a huge explosion in, for example, domain name registration that has the word COVID in it, or coronavirus. A lot more COVID-themed phishing, as you mentioned, more attacks on where the money is today, which is unemployment checks, as well as trying to grab stimulus checks. And just the general fact that because we're not physically co-located anymore, there are a lot of authentication factors we used to kind of assume under the covers that we can't use anymore. If somebody calls the help desk, how are you going to verify them if they can't walk over and show you their CAC? So those sorts of processes have been breaking down, and attackers are taking advantage of those.
Thanks.
And Jeremy, some of the things that we've long held as pretty strong controls, as you mentioned, like the PIV and the CAC card, they have weaknesses in this time because they require, the PIV card requires you to get an in-person validation, and give your fingerprint, and that is not as easy to do. I'm not going to say it's not possible because a lot of agencies have maintained the ability to do that. But it's harder. And so many agencies like my own, for new hires, we are issuing a card that's similar to a PIV card, but it's an alternate. The credential's strong, but you don't have those other aspects of the PIV card, and we'll need to go back and do the in-person verification, get that same identity proofing, and we don't use that for access control of the physical facilities. That'll be just for logical access. You know, also, my agency, we had the good fortune of we had derived PIV already available on my mobile device, that's a great control to use for your mobile devices. But not every agency has been doing that, and I'm sure Duo and other companies that provide multi-factor authentication have been having to come up to speed and helping agencies do that when they don't have a PIV, and but they need to have some multi-factor authentication.
Yeah, so what are some of the, I'd love to talk a little bit to jump ahead. I think we want to come back to some of the discussions on zero trust, but talking about this place we found ourselves where we've got a model built around the PIV card that assumes in-person issuance. What have each of you been seeing in terms of how agencies, or for that matter, the private sector, have been adapting in pushing out alternatives if you can't get a PIV into people's hands, so that they at least have some robust form of MFA? Ross, you talked about some of the alternatives you guys were doing in DHS. Rick, any perspectives from the defense side, or Wendy from any of your, or Sean, where you sit?
Well, we've seen one of our partners that's on the call with us today is Cisco. And so we've seen some agencies look at Cisco Duo. There's been some pilots within DoD. There's been some adoption at other agencies. So from Cisco Duo is an example of a capability, a technology that allows us to push derived credentials to devices without a CAC or a PIV. But really, this is critical. This is a critical conversation, because even in the previous question, one of the areas that we didn't really discuss was personal devices. So non-GFE, non-government furnished equipment is an easy vector, right? Because at the end of the day, mentally, a lot of folks didn't necessarily treat their personal devices the same as they did their government issued systems. And so sometimes children on those devices, other people, they're clicking on things. And when those are opened up to government systems and applications and programs and services and servers, that really increases the attack vector significantly. So that's been something that something like Cisco Duo can help with, but that's kind of what we've been seeing.
Yeah, definitely. And in how you bootstrapping a new application process if you don't have physical proximity. You have to rely on some other shared secrets that you might have, especially if you're onboarding a new employee. You might start with some other information. And once you've seen their device, whatever they're using, and have examined its security state and are able to mark it as trusted, then you can move, you shrunk the attack surface some, and you know that you expect to see that device, even if you don't manage it. Yeah, you can examine it with every authentication and make sure it's still the same one. Consistency in and of itself can be a factor. And so you end up looking at a lot of different factors that will help you bootstrap that initial trust, but then you want to build something consistent that you're using no matter where they are. Even if they come back into the office in the future, the idea of zero trust is that you're using the same consistent methods of authentication with every access, no matter where they are, so that, again, you're not creating gaps that the adversary can take advantage of.
Thanks. And I wanted to actually, talk a little bit more about that, in terms of defining what is zero trust, because it seems like it's everywhere these days. In fact, the last conference we were all able to go to in person, the RSA conference back in February, we talked internally, do you have a zero trust drinking game every time you see or hear it? Then you realize you wouldn't be able to take 3 steps outside of your hotel before you'd pass out on the street, and that'd be the end of the day. In fairness, Wendy, you and Duo were actually one of the first firms out there. I remember, shortly after Google published its The Encore paper that laid out some of the early concepts around zero trust back in 2015, pioneering, some of this concept. you all launched, I think it was called Beyond Core as a service, long before this hype train really left the station. So you have a little credibility here. Can you talk a little bit more about how things like understanding the device and understanding the personal authentication, and what are all the different elements that people should be thinking about when it comes to Zero Trust and executing on it?
Well, first of all, as you mentioned, this concept is not new. In fact, it's at least 20 years old. The Jericho Forum, a bunch of CISOs in financial institutions in the UK, came up with the idea of deperimeterization around 2000. Now, my theory, kind of like yours, is that deperimeterization is too hard to say when you're drunk, and that's why it didn't catch on. But around 2009, John Kindervag, when he was an analyst at Forrester, came up with the term Zero Trust, and it kind of stuck. There was Google's Beyond Corp that was hot for a while, but it's kind of stayed as their brand and so on. But the most important thing is people don't necessarily like the term Zero Trust. CISOs don't like to explain it to their management because it implies that you don't trust the user, and that's not true. What it's really about is questioning all of the assumptions that you have about trust and re-verifying them early and often. So you will hear about things like continuous authentication and continuous monitoring and segmentation of networks, making more of the identity as part of the verification process that you're using. All of these come into play. Now, the way we think about it at Cisco is in different ways. We think about Zero Trust for the workforce, which is basically letting the user access resources, applications, with whatever device they want to be using, no matter where they are and no matter where the application is, whether it's on premises or in the cloud. They should have the same set of verification done every single time, no matter where they are. Now, that's different if you are using, as was mentioned before, systems that don't have a user attached to them, printers, medical equipment, all sorts of other equipment that is intranet enabled, but needs to be segmented, needs to be verified, needs to be uniquely identified no matter how components get switched out in those entities. You need to be able to validate and monitor those. And then finally, in the workload, if you're talking about applications talking to each other on the back end, you also want to make sure that they're authenticating and you're segmenting them and they are not communicating in ways that they're not supposed to. So from those three ways, it ends up sounding very complicated, but if everybody agrees that we should check everybody and every access the same way, regardless of where they are, even if they're inside of a firewall, that's a pretty good, simple place to start.
Thanks. That's a good explanation. Rick, I wanted to turn to you, given your role with WWT and working with the military. Are these kinds of principles and approaches realistic for service branches that you work with to actually implement today?
Well, I mean, the principles are realistic. Obviously, it's going to be like Paul Puckett did a really good job of not only characterizing Zero Trust, but really kind of characterizing the challenges around not just looking at a box or a product, but really looking for a partner. Because at the end of the day, there is no ZT box that you could just go buy and plug it into the wall and now I'm Zero Trust, right? So Zero Trust is an approach. And so from a principles perspective, really taking a risk-based approach versus like a compliance-based approach is really the migration that they have to go through. Within the DoD, historically, it's been all about compliance. You do these annual compliance checks, and you might be good at this particular moment in time on this day out of 365 days. That really doesn't tell you. So as we partner with the DoD and help them get from their current state to some type of projected to be, and they're migrating, and the DoD has to do incremental modernization over time. They have to do technology spirals and sprints, and they have to do things in portions, right? Because they're huge. Paul talked about 1.4 million users in the Army, but the DoD is in excess of 4 million users. So we partner with them to kind of understand the principles of Zero Trust, take a look at where they are, help develop a plan on where they need to be, and then take them through that process so that they can get incrementally closer, and then really understanding the risk associated with every device on the network, like we said, so that they're not just focused on compliance, but they're focused on risk. Even from a compliance perspective, we built a lab for the DoD called a continuous compliance lab, because it's not just a one-time thing. They focus on, the DoD has been fixated on comply to connect. But then what happens after you connect? What happens after this device is on the network? It can fall into a state where it's non-compliant or it's been compromised, and you need that continuous compliance. You need to really understand the risk, and the principles of zero trust can really help any organization get towards eventually implementing the architecture.
Thanks.
Yeah, and that it's proportional in the risk. I've talked to CISOs who said that there are some applications that are not sensitive where they don't care if the user is using what they call a dirty device or they're coming across a dirty network. It doesn't really matter. They can be flexible on that. But there are other ones where they absolutely need to be using government-issued equipment. It needs to be actively managed. It needs to be verified. But they can do it proportionately. It doesn't have to be the same friction across the board for every use case.
Yeah, that's helpful background. Let me ask Sean on the DHS side. Look, not just looking at DHS, but all the civilian agencies. TIC 3.0 was really focused on trying to allow agencies to embrace more modern cloud-based architectures. Can you talk about the intersection of that and how it might allow for even promote zero trust principles as being used to secure them?
Yeah, so I can start off by saying one of the beauties of TIC 3 is the flexibility that will be embedded in the policy itself. So what the guidance that we released does is start to walk the community toward those zero trust principles. But we recognize there's still a large amount of the high-value assets and traditional resources that are still going to rely on a castle moat. And so what TIC 3 does is allow the agency to balance out how they want to secure their environments differently, just like Wendy also mentioned, proportionally. So we introduced some of these concepts in TIC 3. We introduced trust zone concept. The trust zones introduced in TIC 3 mirror well with a trusted resource, a trusted app in the zero trust architecture. Then we also introduced policy enforcement points, which of course are pretty well vetted now and understanding them. But we started to introduce these, and then we also on the same side heard some agencies say, why didn't we introduce policy decision points in TIC 3? And I think that's a great question. That's a question we want to hear from agencies. Why aren't we moving forward? And so ideally what we want to do, again, we have to afford the flexibility to agencies. We plan to come out with a zero trust use case, and then through that use case, then we can start introducing some of the more mature terms or the terms that are more unique to zero trust itself. So that's that journey that we're talking about with zero trust, and not a lift and shift as everyone recognizes. So it's going to take a while for agencies and the communities to move forward, but I'm hoping that the TIC 3 guidance will help support that discussion.
Thanks. And Ross, I wanted to turn to you, given your role in the CDM program. Obviously, CDM at a high level has been focused on how can we get all the agencies, at least in the civilian space, up to a certain level of competence with, I wouldn't say just the basics, but a good foundation of controls they have in place. And a lot of that where you've been focused, I know, has been identity management and governance. And so, one of the questions I wanted to dig into there is sort of building on what Sean had to talk about. Where is CDM supporting this move to the cloud, this move to zero trust? I know up front, so much of what we're trying to do with this is also relying not just on authentication, but authorization being very fine-grained in terms of what are users allowed to do and what aren't they able to do. And would welcome your perspectives on how some of the different initiatives in CDM are playing into that.
So I'd like to talk about it from two perspectives. First, CDM as a framework and a system that can help measure risk for agencies, and that primarily is through our dashboard. We provide capabilities, and the first ones we've done are hardware asset management, which, by the way, in the cloud will be some resource management because they're not the same assets, right? Identity management, who's on the network, came next, We're doing things like managed network security now. And so, you mentioned comply to connect. That is, there's going to be some capabilities that will give the agencies that help them do that. And that introduces things about, the devices and can we have assurance that those devices have some hygiene before we connect them to the network. And all those kind of risk-based decisions, they'll go into the basic dashboard and help agencies view their risk across their enterprise. But CDM also has the ability to, and do the defend task orders, which is where we are in the program. It also has the ability to meet agencies where they need to be. And we've had a number of agencies come to us and ask us for, things that not everybody's getting right now, that some agency needs, and CDM can help meet those needs. And then we'll take the things we learn from that, and then if we do go after a capability more broadly, something we provide for more agencies, we then have the understanding of, what are the kind of things that we learn from that practice that really give us the right information to collect and how to measure the outcomes from that information to make good risk decisions. A great example of that is we have pilots around data management and data loss protection. And the agency that we're doing that with has taught us a lot about, how you understand where your sensitive data is, and then how you apply these service capabilities that will help you protect that data. And that agency happened to be operating a lot in the cloud. So we're going to learn a lot about cloud through that pilot initiative.
Thanks. I appreciate it. Rick, let me ask, given your former role, you were CTO of the Army, how do you think the service branches, let's say we're going to get to a post-COVID environment, where more and more civilian service member contractors are all using a mix of both government-provided equipment as well as personal devices with embedded applications. Where do you see the branches going with all of this?
So right now, many are kind of thinking through the implications of what's going to happen when people come back. Like, come back on post, come back to the Pentagon. So as we're talking to them, what I've brought up is kind of what we used to do in the military, in the Army. When I was in uniform, we did these things called TTXs, or tabletop exercises, or we ran things through battle simulation centers, or et cetera, where basically we would think through the whole process. And at the end of the day, right now, you have people that are using personal devices. Some agencies are equipped to monitor those devices or authenticate people on personal devices, others are not. You have people that are going to come back to the office and maybe bring their laptops back on post and then still work remotely from home a part of the time on their personal device. You have to think through the implications of that. And lastly, just the sheer volume that I think the help desk, every help desk everywhere is going to be inundated with challenges when everybody comes back, right? So just thinking through kind of the current state, what is it going to look like in some type of hybrid model where people are going to come back to work, but I don't think we're really going to ever go back to normal, right? So you're still going to have people working from home. I think that telework is going to be ingrained into pretty much every organization, even in the DoD. So telework days are going to be common. What is that going to look like? What does architecture need to be? What tools do we have in place? What policies, et cetera. But just thinking through the whole process is what we've been doing with our customers to make sure that they're prepared for the eventual return of the workforce.
Thanks. And any other perspectives while we're on this topic of what do things look like when we get back to normal, and what is the new normal?
When you come back, I hate the phrase "the new normal," and everybody I've talked to hates that phrase too. It's like we don't ever want this to be normal. The CSO of Akamai, Andy Ellis, mentioned one time to me that they had implemented zero trust in their environment such that they met the goal that in their buildings, what they really have are Starbucks inside the buildings, where anybody can walk in, sit anywhere. They connect to the Wi-Fi, but they're all treated as if they were across the street at the Starbucks. They're treated as if they were on an external network. So they receive all of the security controls, verifications, and checks every time they connect. They have to comply to connect. And it doesn't matter that they're in the Akamai building. They're being treated exactly the same way. Now, obviously, this isn't going to be practical for a lot of the DoD, and it shouldn't be. But there are some principles that we can work from there to try to future-proof things and understand that we've learned so much in this year that we never thought of before, and we've killed a lot of assumptions that we were going by. At least we can benefit from that and try to have the most flexible solution for when people do come back. And then hopefully the help desk won't be so inundated because it will be as self-service as it can possibly be.
Mm-hmm. Sean or Ross, any other perspectives?
Well, I mean, I'm thinking about, the kind of things that we do have to catch up on when we get back to being on premise more. But I don't think we're ever going to be in the same situation. The benefit of cloud has been demonstrated. I think the services that most agencies are using from the cloud, even if they were dipping the toe in it before, they've moved much more directly to using those because they match much more closely to the kind of architecture they need to be in when they're working from home. So I think it's going to be, will change again, but I think it's going to be a different future that we have because people are going to have experienced things that they may not have experienced for some years unless this had occurred.
Thanks. And I wanted to ask, we've only got a few minutes left, go into some of the Q&A that's been coming in while we've been talking. There's been a couple different people who have asked about different approaches to authentication. And I kind of want to take a couple of their questions and synthesize it in terms of laying out this, which is the way we do computing has changed. We now have things like wearables that, one question was, hey, could we use something like a smartwatch that could leverage a built-in biometric to authenticate me behind the scenes? Do I still need a card anymore? Wanted to, get everybody's perspectives in terms of sort of where we're at today. We've gone from PIV to derived credential, and 1917 gave agencies some flexibilities to go beyond the PIV platform to use other kinds of authentication. What are some of the things that you think we're going to need to start thinking about as technology advances to enable, well, basically new models for authentication? And where do you see some of this going in both government and outside?
Well, I think if you go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, from my perspective, there's two categories of people, of identities that I think we need to consider. It's workforce identities, and those identities that need to be pretty well controlled because they have high privileges in your environment, and then the citizen who interacts with the government, which I think they need to have a more varied set of authenticators to be able to interact with the government well. The challenge there is how do we make sure we know who they are? And I think that's one of the things that people like Login.gov and these other organizations are working through to kind of standardize that method. And then for the workforce, I do think one of the real benefits of the PIV card is the fact that we have this strong identity assurance, and then we can use that for many other authentication mechanisms. One thing that I'll say that we haven't looked at all, generally speaking, has been some of these signals that you can get from your mobile devices that can continuously monitor your activity and your behavior, how you hold, and all these things that you call environmental biometrics, right? Which can really be a strong signal, and I don't think we've really looked at that very well. And I think it'll be something we'll look at in the future because it can give a good risk signal along with the device itself as to have assurance that individual is who that person is.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's a very good plug for user and entity behavioral analysis, where either you said somebody may have taken over, have hijacked the session or something, or you were wrong in the first place when you thought it was really them. And based on their behavior now that they're in session, you may want to step up and add some additional authentication factors and say, no, we're going to check again. But I absolutely understand the struggle. Everybody has those special users, and you know who they are, who say, can I use my Apple Watch while I'm jogging? I don't want to carry this other thing. And you want to be able to say, yes, you can authenticate to see your unclassified email, but you cannot use it to log in to see other things. Sorry. So that's what we're talking about with the privileged and proportionate authentication that we want to be able to establish in the future. PIV is great if you want to keep PIV. we can help set in other factors that help bolster your sense of trust in that user. And for state and local government that don't have that, they're going to have to make do with another combination of authentication factors. So that's where we want to try to cover all the bases and retain what continues to work.
Yeah. Yeah, Jeremy, I think what Wendy and Ross are talking about, what I would call it basically like the next generation of two-factor authentication. So it's going to be still a requirement for two-factor authentication, but we may not necessarily require a physical CAC or physical PIV. So we can do that, like has been stated, maybe another way, maybe the way that I carried my phone, maybe my voice, maybe other things. But the two-factor portion, I think, is still going to be a requirement. But even the user behavioral analytics may be part of my identity at the end of the day. But moving towards the next generation of two-factor, having different options as it relates to what that other factor is going to be, and then enabling that throughout the network.
Yeah, and if you're trying to do gate analysis or something like that as an authentication factor, I can tell you right now at my age, I walk differently every time I get up in the morning. So that kind of factor is not going to be working for me very well. But yes, there are a lot of additional factors that are being developed, including some that will help with passwordless, which is a big bane for a lot of people. And basically, the possibilities and the options are getting more and more, and this is a really good time to look at them and take advantage of them.
We lose Jeremy?
Yeah, he might have frozen. So
we lost Jeremy, I think.
Can you guys hear me? So this is Rob. We're at the 5 o'clock mark. I do want to close it out though real quick with one more round of just kind of what you want to leave the audience with. We'll start with Sean, and then we'll go Rick, Ross, and Wendy. Just kind of closing thoughts. Where you think we should go next? What do you think the most important thing is we heard today? Anything like that? So start with Rick. Go ahead.
Thanks, Ross, and thank you for the opportunity to the team. I'll just close by saying at Worldwide Technology, where I work, we've spent a lot of time building out this thing called our digital platform, and it's available to everyone just by going to wwt.com. So I do recommend that those that are watching, please do that. Go check out what we have. It's a $500 million investment that we opened it up to the public. So a lot of what we talked about today is available for you to peruse and to take a look at and even leverage from a lab perspective. So I'll close with that.
Sean Connolly.
Yeah, one thing that's interesting from my side is be very tactical. The TIC program's on the hook to release a number of use cases. There's an infrastructure as a service use case still to be released, SaaS, PAS, email, and some other ones. To get back to what Wendy was talking about, what does that mean now that we move to this new environment? How does this change? I think if we came out with those use cases a year ago even, they'd be really different than they may look like going forward. So it's an interesting time to have this discussion. I'm glad that we've had the opportunity to talk about this today. Ross, thank you.
Ross Ford.
Sorry about that. I was muted. Yeah. So I think whatever you're doing right now, take a risk-based approach to what you do. Right? There's a lot of things that agencies are having to do that don't comply with the compliancy model that worked when we were all working in an office and we were really trying to work from that. The government's open to that, but do it based upon logic, and then you should do it based upon an eye on the future. The 800-207 document from NIST for Zero Trust is a good document. And what I think you should pay attention to is the 7 tenets, because if you go down those tenets, you'll be able to see things that I can see that. That's something that I could do right now and leverage that with the capabilities I have in place. So that's kind of like start where you are, and that's how you bridge to the future. It's begin where you can begin and something you can see that you can really add value right now.
And Wendy, take us home.
All right. I'd like to go way back to the beginning where Dean Skontras talked about our mission to democratize security, and talk a little bit more about what that means. Drawing from Paul Puckett's description of how he's trying to affect a culture change where everything that we use in IT, data and systems, are mission critical now. They are not something that's just an IT thing that the IT people use. You know, it's what we use now is not a stapler anymore. The data and systems and operations are so mission critical that they really have to be owned and understood and appreciated by every service member who's using it. And they need to be able to use it in the way that works best for them. And that's what democratizing security is about. So going forward, what we would, really like to offer is the opportunity to help with use cases that the card can't deal with and bolster security across the board for whatever strange use cases come up in the future, because I certainly wouldn't want to predict them going forward.
That's great. Thank you very much. Thank you all very much for participating today. And thank you to the audience for listening in. We'll have this live and updated on our website in the next few days. So stay tuned and we'll send you the link. All right. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Ross.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.